This is Virginia Peterson, and we're embarking on the second of a series of 10 discussions with Ashley Montagu, the well-known anthropologist, on what Dr. Montagu himself describes as the nature of human nature. And in our initial talk, Dr. Montagu, you made a statement to the effect that life does not begin at 40 or even at birth, but at the moment of conception. That seems to be a good point to start with. One could hardly start any sooner.
Yes, well, life begins at conception. It should be quite obvious, although for some reason we have traditionally been thinking of life as beginning at birth, and we reckon, of course, the age of an individual from birth rather than from conception, although the Chinese, being much wiser than we do, recognize the fact, and when they look a fact in the face, can see it without blanching, and so reckon age from conception rather than, as we do, from birth. But before we get to the point of conception, in order to understand what this creature is who is being conceived, I would like to go back into prehistory and trace the origin and the development of the nature of human nature as a result of the experiences which the precursors of man had in the course of evolution. The homeland where the human species originated is believed by most authorities to be Africa, somewhere in the vicinity of the lower part of equatorial Africa, perhaps a little south of the equator, towards South Africa, or Rhodesia, in this general area. We know from such little geological evidence as we have from this vast area that there were changes in the climate at various times during the geological period known as the Pliocene, which lasted some 11 million years and precedes the geological period which was the period in which man underwent his evolution, namely the Pleistocene, which lasted 1 million years and which came to an end some, say, 25,000 years ago.
May I ask how these immense, incalculable periods of time are calculated? Are they very hypothetical?
No, they're very basic and very factual. One of the most frequent methods used is the decay of uranium to lead. It takes a certain amount of uranium to decompose into lead. When you find lead and uranium products in the same kind of rocks, you have some measure by which you can calculate from the quantity of uranium and the quantity of lead in these rocks the period of time that has elapsed. And there are other methods by which you can compute on the basis of the time that it takes to deposit certain strata, how long this took in relation to the kind of vegetation and the kind of fossil bones that you find, the chemical analysis of these bones, and even the radioactive analysis of these materials. For more recent periods of time, the carbon-14 content of bones and fossil plants yields us information up to 50,000 years ago. And in Africa, during the Pliocene, it appears that there were certain changes in the climate which took the form of a withdrawal of the rainfall further and further northward, so that the southern parts of Africa, below the equator, became deforested, and what was formerly a forest was turned into open savanna, open plains, more or less treeless, with sparse vegetation. Animals, you see, that had been living in forested regions would then be called upon to adjust themselves over this long period of secular time, this 11 million years, to the new kinds of environment. In the forest, you can live on the vegetation, and so you're a vegetarian. All the animals of the order to which man belongs, so-called the primates, pronounced primates instead of primates in the Latin form, because of the desirability of avoiding any identification of high ecclesiastical members of the church with apes and monkeys. And therefore we refer to the apes and monkeys, even though man is also a member of this order, as primates, namely anthropoid-like creatures in particular. An anthropoid-like creature is a tailless ape. He's obliquely quadrupedal. He doesn't stand directly, but he locomotes on his hind legs and on his forelimbs, resting on his knuckles, like the gorilla or the chimpanzee or the orangutan do today.
He's halfway up.
Yes, exactly, halfway up. Not completely a quadruped, not completely erect, halfway up, as you've said. Now, in the forest, he lives on vegetation. But in the savanna, where there is little vegetation, he must now begin to live on other animals. And so he becomes an omnivorous creature who, for the first time in his experience, is called upon to hunt other animals. This means that he generally has to run after small game. Big game come later.
Is it generally established that there were no predatory animals before the forests receded and the fields opened up?
Oh yes, there were predatory animals, but not the apes and monkeys. The monkeys and apes are virtually exclusively vegetarian and do not prey on other animals. The most they will do will eat an egg of a bird or insects or a small lizard, and that's about all. Some of them are exclusively vegetarian. On the savannas, they have to hunt. Well, if you hunt better if you can run fast and you can throw stones or implements at the objects you're trying to pursue. Well, clearly, those apes that could do so, and do so more efficiently than the others, were more likely to survive in the struggle for existence than those who could not, and therefore breed others of their own kind who could stand erectly, run fastly, use their forelimbs, which are now freed, for the making of implements, and also free themselves from those instincts which cause the apes and monkeys to respond to the environment without premeditation, but instinctively.
Was it the hand that developed the brain, or the brain that developed the hand?
I really don't know the answer to that question. The hand certainly was freed, the forelimb was freed, and if anything, it was vision more than any other human sense that contributed most to the development of the human species. But even this is a partial answer, because what has contributed most to the development of the human species was this freedom from the instinctive equipment which conditioned the animal to respond in a certain limited way, whereas creatures who in the hunt, you see, were now called upon to use their intelligence would be favored, who relied more upon intelligence than upon a predetermined response, and thus would be increasingly, over this course of 11 million or so years, completely freed from instincts and now have to rely entirely upon the problem-solving equipment of their intelligence.
Well, by vision, did you mean the intelligence, the symbolic meaning of vision, or did you mean sight?
I meant sight. The intelligence, of course, is the important thing, the ability to stop and think and to say, wait a minute, what do I do now? How best do I meet this situation?
Haven't animals had that?
Oh, but in the course of evolution toward man, you do get to a point where some animals, before they get to being man, have this. You see, man wasn't suddenly jumped out of an ape straight into a man. There was undoubtedly a gradual evolutionary process. And if we ever discovered the links, not the missing link, many missing links, we would find that the earlier types were perhaps less well endowed with intelligence than the later types, that the earlier types were more instinctive than the later types and more likely to rely upon their intelligence for the responses.
Are the links being sought still, or are people comfortable with this theory and just assuming that we originated as a kind of ape?
Many links are missing, and they're certainly being sought. And there is no doubt that it was an ape-like creature, or ape-like group of creatures from which the human species originated. And the process that I want to emphasize and underscore in this is that the course of development of these early precursors of man entailed a great deal of cooperative activity among them. In other words, the more you became freed from your instinctive drives, the more and more you became dependent upon learning for what you were subsequently to do as a human being. This meant that your period of dependency as an infant had to be increased in order to take care of the amount of information you must acquire as a human being, and you had to have a mother who would cooperate with you, the completely dependent infant, in such a way that she would nourish and support you and teach you as the father would in his very removed kind of way as compared with what the mother's function would be. After all, mother gestates the baby and she nurses the baby, and she is the one who is most closely associated with it. And in the course of evolution, the maternal qualities, functions, and traits were highly valued, and those mothers who possessed them would tend more frequently to survive and leave a progeny behind them who inherited similar traits. And hence you see now a picture which is internally consistent of the precursors of man evolving toward human status. One, as being freed from their instinctive drives. Two, to replace their instinctive drives with intelligence. Three, cooperation as part and parcel of all this, and the development of increasingly larger periods of dependency of the human infant upon the mother, and pari passu with this process, the development by the human mother of traits which make her independent with the young in such a way that she gives it all the supports and encouragements that it needs for its realization of its potentialities.
Which in turn must have entailed a system of communication between mother and child.
Oh, indeed, and by this time speech would have developed, but of course communication doesn't necessarily involve speech. One can communicate without speech, but the theory that speech developed with the precursors of man is one I think that we must all subscribe to, because the ability to use one's intelligence effectively implies the ability to manipulate symbols, and also the ability to communicate these symbols, not necessarily in any written form, but simply by some means, the most economic form of which would be by sound.
By grunts.
Not necessarily grunts. Why should you have grunts?
They seem to be the most instinctive sounds.
Well, no, the grunt theory is identified with the idea that prehistoric men were all very brutal, animalistic kind of characters. This is, of course, a projection of ourselves, who are very much more brutal characters than any form of prehistoric man probably ever was.
But that in turn is an assumption.
That in turn is not an assumption. It is based on extremely good evidence, namely the existing non-literate peoples, who certainly are not primitive or prehistoric men in the sense that these early prehistoric men were. But there is no more reason to doubt that our early pre-human ancestors were the brutal kind of creatures than there is reason to believe that primitive men, so-called, non-literate peoples, are the kind of brutal creatures that we were led to believe they were in the Victorian period, when it was considered a very nice thing for highly civilized whites to exterminate these brutal primitive people, because after all they were incapable of learning, of exploiting their own natural resources, and it really was a good thing to help them on toward extinction. I mean, the white man, I believe, is the only man who can claim the very dubious honor of having exterminated whole races for their own good. The American Indian never achieved such a triumph.
The American Indian did some extermination, however.
Well, the American Indian had a great many excellent teachers, namely the whites. For example, scalping was not an Indian trait. We always talk about the Indian who went around scalping whites. The Indians learned to scalp whites from the whites who scalped Indians.
Well, am I in my ignorance to banish my heretofore conviction that the caveman pulling his wife by the hair and slinging her over his shoulder and murdering another caveman for a piece of meat was not rooted in pictures on the walls of caves, but simply in man's imagination?
These are creations of white men. Whenever a white man wants to say that another man behaved in a particularly and peculiarly indecently human manner, he says he behaved like a beast. Anything that human beings do that we consider obnoxious, we project upon others, usually non-human beings, or human beings are incapable of defending themselves. We say he behaved like Neanderthal man. Well, all the evidence we have about Neanderthal man indicates that he was by no means the brute in any sense that most whites are.
Well, the way we picture him, he certainly didn't have a very sensitive face.
Oh, yes, but this is another way in which we project our own ideas upon him.
But what about the pictures on the walls of the earliest caves that have been found?
Well, there are no representational pictures of men.
There are no
of their
representations
faces.
of men.
Not of their faces. You have men in skins of other animals, but you don't see their faces actually as representational as would enable you to reconstruct, for example, what they in fact looked like. You have stylized versions of body, which wouldn't really enable you to reconstruct the body, except that you know that it's meant to represent a human body. But if you really want to see what some Neanderthal men of the cartoonist's imagination looked like, all you have to do is to travel on the New York subway.
Or to look at Al Cap's drawings.
Well, yes, of course, the drawings are very good representations of what some people think Neanderthal man looked like, but he didn't look anything like that. And as a matter of fact, the idea that he had a bull neck or that he walked in a knock-kneed fashion is simply an error perpetrated by people who just didn't know enough anatomy.
But he did have a very low brow.
No, he didn't have a low brow. He had quite a good brow. What he did have was overhanging eyebrows called supraorbital tori, which kept the rain out of his eyes and also acted as a natural sunshade. And this makes, you see, his brow look much lower than it was. But in fact, he had a brain that was on the average at least as large and as heavy as our brain.
Well, is the weight and the size of the brain indicative of its capacity in general?
No, it is not. The average weight of the human brain among whites is, say, 1,400 grams. And you can have a brain that weighs 750 grams and be perfectly normally intelligent. In fact, the largest brains on record weighed about 2,800 grams. One belonged to a United States senator and the other one belonged to an idiot.
We're an awful long way, however, from conception of modern man, are we not?
Ah, yes. Well, let's get back to this. That in the evolution of man, quite a number of very interesting elements have been, as it were, interdependent with one another and have worked toward the ultimate expression of the kind of human nature that the human being is possessed of at conception. Now, to say that a human being is possessed of human nature at conception is quite a large order, but there can be very little doubt that in the genes, those chemical packages in the chromosomes, which one derives from one's mother, 23 chromosomes, and from one's father, 23 chromosomes, making a total of 46. And in each of those chromosomes, there are hundreds at least of these genes, these chemical packages, which actually are the carriers of heredity. And do what you will, other things being equal, in the 266.5 days during which the human being takes to get developed in the womb, these genes will undergo expression in a very definite manner such as is determined by their inherent chemical structures and will result in a human being who at birth has a very definite arrangement of potentialities for being human, which means the capacity to relate himself to other human beings, to learn to talk, to stand upright and to walk and to jump and to run, to think abstractly, to concentrate, and all those other qualities which we identify with the process of becoming human.
But these genes carry in them traits of the parents and the grandparents and the great-grandparents. Do they carry an unexpected element too, an outside element that has nothing to do with the direct descendants of the child, or don't we know?
Well, that's an excellent question. Let me, in the first place, correct a rather common misapprehension about what the genes carry. The genes do not carry traits. For example, they don't carry noses, they don't carry eyes, they don't carry lips.
Then how is it that you have the mouth of your great-aunt Hannah and the nose of that grandfather of yours who didn't have a very distinguished nose?
The answer is that we don't know. But what we do know is that certainly the nose isn't in the genes. In the first place, it's too big to be in the gene, and a gene is a very submicroscopic molecule.
Well, the whole thing seems much too big to be in genes.
Yes. But you see, what are carried in the genes are chemical substances which carry, as it were, information. Information for this part of the nose, and others carry for that part of the nose, and depending upon their position and their chemical structure, they eventually result in the course of development in a nose which is largely influenced, if not determined, by what is in those chemicals and which have interacted with other chemicals to make duplicates of the information carried in the genes, which eventually get together in some way that we do not understand at the present time to give a definite form and shape and structure to this nose, and color to this iris of the eye, and to the pigment of the skin, and to every part of the body.
But it surely isn't an old wives' tale that we resemble our forebears in some way.
It certainly isn't an old wives' tale. We resemble our forebears because we have got chemical packages from them which in their own cases have also been active in making their particular form and structure. But we also inherit chemical packages which have been derived from more recent ancestors, which our earlier ancestors did not possess, and hence are mixed in with the chemical packages derived from our grandparents and great-grandparents. We very seldom get a group of chemical packages of genes together which are an exact duplicate of the genes contained in one or other or both our ancestors. In fact, this has probably never occurred. The probabilities are so astronomically high against any two individuals ever being alike because there are so many genes involved. You see, there are estimated to be about 30,000 genes in the human genetic system. There are also chemicals outside the genes and changes in temperature in the environment in which they're undergoing development, and changes of pressure, and changes in various kinds of gases that may be in the vicinity.
So that during conception, the combination that the person is going to be can change still?
Precisely. Conception and the chemical packages, the genes that you receive from your mother and father are not the end of the story, they're only the beginning. The beginning undergoes a complication, a development. By development we mean increase in complexity. By growth we mean increase in size.
Is there the possibility of outside influence while the fetus is still in the womb?
Yes, and the outside influence may come about from a number of different sources. For example, one may classify them under physical agents. In the womb, let us take a pair of identical twins who are derived from the same egg, which means that they have the same chemical packages from which they originate and develop. Now, at birth, it is well known that one twin may be heavier, even considerably heavier than the other. One of them may have, as one finds subsequently, after some years, more intelligence than the other. One may be rather slower in his movements than the other. One may have a visual capacity which is more acute. Now, in most cases, we really can't explain the origin of these differences in identical twins, but when one finds that one twin, for example, has an umbilical cord tied round his neck, now this may, in the course of his development, have cut off a certain amount of the oxygen that was getting to his brain, and this may have done some damage to his brain cells. It's in this area, you see, of this kind of observation that we can only conjecture as to the causes producing these differences.
But those are internal events that
Yes,
take place. What about external events? What about the stories we're all brought up on? Don't let a pregnant woman be frightened by a mad dog or by an automobile coming around a corner too suddenly. Can things happening to the mother affect the fetus?
Indeed they can, but let's take these things one by one and exhaust the physical effects. For example, if a mother has an addiction, say, to morphine, she's been taking morphine before her pregnancy, during her pregnancy, it is a well-known fact that the fetus, the baby that is born, perfectly normal in other ways, will exhibit all the symptoms of a morphine addict. And the treatment for such babies is precisely the same that is given to morphine addicts. This shows that the fetus is not as insulated from the mother as we were once taught. A great number of substances held in suspension, that is to say, in liquid form, pass through the placenta. The placenta is a semi-permeable membrane which will admit generally molecules of a size below 1/30,000th of an inch in diameter. This means that a very large number of things can actually get through the placenta
Although
from
blood
the mother.
does not.
Blood doesn't, because the blood cells are far too large. They're gigantic. But anything in the form of a hormone, for example, secreted from the mother's glands, the glands of internal secretion that put their secretions directly into the bloodstream, are small enough molecules to be able to pass through the placenta. Now, your question about these old wives' tales about the mother's emotional experiences, being frightened, etc., communicating themselves in some way to the fetus is a very, very pertinent one here, because the evidence is very interesting in this connection. Supposing we take such an actual case of a mother who is present at a circus where the tent catches on fire. I'm talking now of an actual case in my own knowledge and experience. During the 7th month of pregnancy, and she is perfectly healthy, her husband is perfectly healthy, they're young adults, and they have a good family history, and a child is born, and this child cries a great deal of the time. He's very hyper-irritable. He exhibited hyper-irritability even before he was born. What happened when the tent caught on fire? There was a great, great rush toward the exits. This mother jumped over a fence, became unconscious, and then found herself outside the tent. She was very greatly upset, of course, during the experience. And what could have been the effects upon the child. When I saw the child, he was 9 years of age, and I observed him as a very interesting child who was rather halting in his conversation, slow in his movements, and exceedingly sensitive. Now, what happened in this mother's case, almost certainly, because there are innumerable other cases now to support the kind of analysis I'm going to give you, is that she was terribly shocked by this frightful fire, set these people all in a panic and in hysterics. What went on in her nervous system roughly was describable as follows. Ideas in her grey matter of her brain were those of horror, fear. These immediately passed down into her midbrain and out of the portion of her hypothalamus from which a stalk arises, at the end of which there is a pea-shaped gland, also the size of a pea, known as the pituitary gland. This pituitary gland has three parts, an anterior part, an intermediate part, and a posterior part. The anterior and posterior parts are secretory. They secrete hormones. The anterior part secretes a hormone, which most of us have heard, called ACTH, which has been used for the treatment of a good many disorders, and ACTH simply stands for adrenocorticotrophic hormone, which means merely the hormone from the pituitary gland, the anterior part of the pituitary gland, stimulates the external cortex of the adrenal gland, which is situated on top of the kidneys, and causes that adrenal gland to secrete its hormones, chiefly identified to most of us with the adrenal gland as adrenaline. ACTH has the effect of causing not only the adrenal cortex to secrete hormones, but undoubtedly other hormones secreted at the same time by the anterior pituitary cause a fair number of other hormones to be put into the bloodstream from the other endocrine glands of the body. These have the effect of passing through the placenta into the fetus, and they're acting upon the fetus, you see. And the activity of the fetus is greatly increased as a result of reception of these new chemical substances, and he becomes hyperactive and highly sensitized and quite irritable in the sense that he now responds to stimuli rather more freely than he formerly did.
This would indicate that the Chinese are right in beginning life with conception, because it shows that something can happen besides biological determinism.
Yes.
Already before birth.
Yes, of course. And this is the whole point of my interest in the life of the fetus in the womb. I'm interested in a womb with a view, as it were. In
a womb of one's own?
Yes. In other words, getting to inspect the life of the fetus in the womb long before he is born in order to discover whether anything that happens to him within the womb is of significance for his subsequent development. Now, there are a good many cases on record now of studies of this kind, in which the evidence strongly supports the idea that the mother's emotional disturbances are sufficiently prolonged, and in many cases, if not in all, is capable of affecting the fetus in utero. We've learned a great deal about physical effects on the fetus. For example, we've learned that the fetus is capable of hearing.
Hearing?
Hearing, in that he will respond to sounds of various kinds, pitch, vibration, sudden loud noises, and anyone can check this for himself. All he needs, of course, is a pregnant female, and perhaps after the 5th month of pregnancy you play some Bach, or if you like Mozart, and Arnold Schoenberg, and see how he responds to these different composers.
Undoubtedly more nervously to Mr. Schoenberg.
Undoubtedly. I met a young woman who, after hearing me talk on this subject, said she had to give up her job as a typist during the last 3 months of her pregnancy, because every time the carriage on her typewriter went back to its original position, the fetus jumped. And this became extremely uncomfortable for her, and no doubt was uncomfortable for the fetus.
But the jumps are, for the most part, haphazard, are they not? The jumps are simply indications of vitality or a shift of position of being
Oh,
fetus.
yes, but in the case of a loud noise, you see, a sudden loud noise, it apparently affects the fetus unpleasantly, and I don't put unpleasantly in quotes, because he responds with behavior which is the end effect of experiences which have impinged upon his nervous system, indicating that this is a kind of shock, and indeed is a shock, and in an adult or a child would be described as a shock. Now, we not only know that he's capable of responding to sounds, I mean, standing near a piano or a loud symphony concert or a vibration of a washing machine. For example, Dr. Spelt of Allentown some years ago was able to teach a fetus in utero, so that we now can look forward to a profession not only of pediatricians but of fetatricians, who will begin teaching children who start school while they're still in womb. What he did was to take a doorbell buzzer from which he removed the actual buzzer and left only the vibrator, and sounded this against the mother's abdomen so that the fetus could hear it, and the fetus did not respond. But he made a loud noise at the same time, to which the fetus did jump. Then he made the loud noise and the vibrator go at the same time, and after 11 times in one case, 19 times in another, when he no longer made the loud noise, the fetus started responding to the vibrator.
Was it a very nervous baby?
No, but some studies of this kind have actually been made. For example, studies have been made to determine the behavior differences in children who were delivered by high forceps, low forceps, no forceps, you see, and significant differences have turned up.
Well, there's a whole psychoanalytic theory, is there not, that the actual birth of a child is an emotional experience affecting the personality?
Yes, this is the theory of
the
trauma.
Do you subscribe to that
I
theory?
certainly subscribe to this, as I will at some length show you. This theory is a perfectly sound one. The evidence fully substantiates it. In the case of dear fetus in the womb, there are a good many other things that I'd like to say about him. In the first place, we have discovered that the most important experience, apart from the mother's well-being, is her nutrition, the nutritional status of the mother. This is extremely important because we find that if the nutrition of the mother during pregnancy has not been adequate, that the child may show all sorts of defects.
How would you then account for the children who were born in concentration camps as a result of the recent upheavals all over the world and who seem to have turned out to be rather brilliant people who made their own way very successfully?
There is a study by Dr. Klebanov of either Berlin or Vienna in which he studied women 10 years after they'd left the concentration camp and studied their children and found a tremendous number of abnormalities in the children, which he traces to the experiences which the mothers had undergone during their sojourn for more or less durable periods of time in the concentration camps.
But that there have been many normal ones, too, seems rather extraordinary, considering the well-known fact that the diet was less than subsistence diet for everyone.
Yes, in certain cases this appears to be true, but on the whole the evidence indicates that this be the exception rather than the rule, both the experimental and the observed evidence. For example,
it raises the question of whether we are all chemistry or whether we are perhaps another element that's unknown.
Well, I don't think that we're all chemistry, but we're certainly a good many elements that are also unknown, but these all belong within the domain of the natural and certainly not in the domain of anything supernatural.
You're very carefully avoiding the use of the word soul, are you not?
Oh, I don't know what the soul is. This is a word. I wouldn't go so far as to say that simply because we can't weigh and measure it, that it doesn't exist, but what others talk about from a theological point of view as a soul, I have no knowledge of.
I wasn't thinking of the theological, but the poetical. It stands for something. It is a symbol of something that none of us can see or touch.
I don't call that a soul because the words are very much embarrassed. Words like soul and words like race belong in the same class. They've become so emotionally weighted that it's quite impossible to discuss these terms dispassionately.
I think you've chosen two unjust things to put together, because the emotional weight that's placed on the word soul is simply our own admission that we all have something that no one quite understands that sets us apart from all other living creatures.
Yes, but I mean, lots of people believe that we all have within us certain endowments which in fact we do not have. Lots of people have believed and willing to give their lives up for ideas which had no reality whatsoever, nor substance of any kind in them, which we have subsequently come to know as false ideas. There are lots of people who still persist that the world is flat and that the sun actually travels round the earth, and they're passionately wedded to these ideas, and there are whole cultures that are.
But everyone is wedded to the idea that we have something which you don't need to call soul if you don't want to, but which is inexplicable by any amount of anthropological studies so far.
I don't know that everyone is wedded to such an idea.
Ordinary lay people certainly are.
Ah, ordinary lay people. Ordinary lay people have laid more than one awful egg. And this is why, presumably, they're called lay people.
Have anthropologists never laid an egg?
Oh, certainly, very sizable ones, but they're willing to admit and ready to agree that not only have they laid them, but will no doubt continue to lay others.
And hatch them?
Well, this is, of course, the function of the anthropologist, to lay a good egg and to let posterity hatch it.
We're a long way from posterity. We haven't even gotten that fetus out of the womb yet.
Well, when you began to bring up such matters as the soul, we were, I think, in the process of discussing the importance of nutrition for the development of the fetus. And we know that not only is it necessary for the mother to have an adequate diet to avoid all sorts of ill consequences for the fetus, but that it is extremely important for her to undergo an experience which is emotionally happy. And this emotional, happy experience is highly correlated with the nutrition, because it doesn't matter how good the food she may be ingesting is. If her emotional state is unsatisfactory, if she's unhappy, then this will interfere in many cases with her nutrition, and, if not with her nutrition, with the nutrition of the fetus.
But many children must have been born who contributed a great deal to the world, but whose mothers were very unhappy when they were pregnant.
Oh, undoubtedly. But just as in medicine, the pathological, the morbid expression of a function is often capable of teaching us a great deal about the normal expression of this function or of an organ, so we take these extreme cases as, for example, the mother who has been emotionally disturbed during the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. In many cases, there has been some evidence that cleft palate and hair lip has resulted from nothing more nor less than the disturbed emotional state of the mother, and it has been experimentally tested. If you examine the embryo's development, you find that the area which is going to develop into palate and lip starts developing at the end of the 7th week. The 8th week is a critical period in the development of the anterior part of the face. For the sides of your upper jaw and a good part of the front of your upper jaw come into being at the end of the 7th week of embryonic life. At the end of the 8th week, there appears a center for what is known as the premaxilla, that portion of the upper jaw which holds the 4 upper teeth. Now, should there be any disturbance of a chemical nature, or even of a mechanical nature in this period, there will be a disturbance in the union of the premaxilla, which holds the 4 upper teeth, with the maxilla, which ultimately gives support to the rest of the teeth, and together form your upper jaw. Now, if for some reason the chemical disturbance works in such a way as to affect the rate to which the maxilla grows, the sides of your upper jaw, and allows the premaxilla to grow at a normal rate, but at a rate in excess of that which it would normally grow at in relation to the maxilla, then the premaxilla grows forward, and the maxilla on each side cannot grow toward the front because it is interrupted by the growing premaxilla, which has put itself forward, and you get a double hair lip and cleft palate on both sides, but you can get every kind of variety of this hair lip. Now, Dr. Peer and Dr. Stream, the one a plastic surgeon, the other a dentist, both have investigated mothers in New Brunswick, New Jersey, who underwent a very thorough survey, and what they did was to discover the mothers who had children with hair lip and cleft palate. Then they asked them what their experiences were during pregnancy, and they found that in large percentage of cases, not in all, by any means, they had had a emotionally disturbed kind of experience. And they then reasoned that they had secreted a great deal of ACTH from their pituitaries into the system, and so they produced an experiment which they gave rats in a similar period in which these bones were developing injections of cortisone and ACTH, and produced 100% of hair, lip, and cleft palate in 100% of hair, lip, and cleft palate in these creatures. Now, these experiments and these observations are by no means the final word, but they give one an idea of the kind of things that may be involved, the kind of means by which this kind of abnormality may be produced, and also tell one the kind of work that is being done in this area.
What you're really saying then is that the life of the fetus is not only a chemical and mechanical process within, but that also the outside world impinges through the nutrition of the mother and through the mother's emotional and psychological experience,
yes,
so that the fetus is controlled both from the inside and the outside.
This is the really important point, as you've summed it up, but I'd also like to point out that the fetus lives quite an important life as he develops in the womb. There he is suspended in his mother's amniotic fluid by the umbilical cord, sort of rocked in the cradle of the deep thereof, living the life of Riley with the second law of thermodynamics beautifully satisfied, where the temperature and the pressure is constant. And other things being equal, we now know that he swallows the mother's amniotic fluid, but he won't if he doesn't like the taste of it. And you see, he discriminates. As Carl de Snoe, the great Dutch obstetrician, discovered, there's a condition from which women suffer, which is known as polyhydramnios, which means that the amniotic fluid increases and increases and increases until the mother's abdomen swells and becomes extremely painful. And Carl de Snoe reasoned that maybe this was due to the fact that the fetus wasn't drinking his mother's amniotic fluid. So in order to test this hypothesis, he injected some saccharine directly into the amniotic fluid itself, whereupon the fetus began to drink huge quantities of saccharine, amniotic fluid, and down went these mothers' abdomini.
An early version of Coca-Cola?
Now there you have a brilliant idea, you see. We could actually put the rival drink into circulation by simply injecting Pepsi-Cola into the mother's amniotic fluid, and thus conditioning. You see, the possibilities for the Madison Avenue boys have been completely missed. However, here's an idea being gratuitously thrown out to them. Now, another thing I'd like to talk about is, in connection with the fetus, one of the gases most frequently consumed, one of the gases with which you at the moment are polluting this fresh air, namely tobacco smoke. The smoking mother. What about the smoking mother? Does she affect the fetus? The answer is yes. We have very good evidence that the smoking of the mother increases the heartbeat of the fetus. And while at 7 months, for example, the normal heartbeat of the fetus is 130 beats per minute, one puff on a cigarette by a mother has been known to speed up the heartbeat to 179 beats per minute, from 130 to 179 beats per minute.
Well, would the speeding up of the heartbeat affect the chemistry of the rest of the fetus?
Well, certainly it would not only affect the chemistry, it would affect the longevity, because a heart that beats more rapidly than a heart that beats normally is likely to wear itself out, just as a pump is. And furthermore, it's a very real question whether a fetal heart should be called upon to indulge in such unwanted exercise, and it's a very real question whether there may not be such a relation between smoking mothers in the 20th century and the increase in cardiac conditions. I don't know that this is so. This may be a silly idea. There may be some soundness. It's a matter for research to determine. And so, to wind this all up, and I've only touched upon the periphery of the knowledge that is available on this subject, I would say that the life that the human being lives in the womb during the 266.5 days which he takes to get ready for birth is a vastly more complicated one in both the physical and the psychological sense than we've hitherto suspected, and we have to acquaint ourselves with the necessary knowledge and then make the necessary arrangements for keeping the mother as happy and as well equilibrated as possible so that the fetus may be born as happy and well equilibrated as we could expect. In addition, we have to ask ourselves this question: what is it that the experience of the fetus may inscribe in his organism? What changes may therein occur as a result of the experiences he undergoes in the womb that may influence in a very significant manner his subsequent development as a human being? And this is a question which I'm deeply interested in, one which I hope we shall explore further. The principal practical use of such knowledge as we are acquiring in this area would be to contribute to the healthier development of the human being, not only as a fetus and as an infant, but as laying the foundations for his postnatal development as well and truly as we possibly could.
What you're really doing is charging the mother with still further responsibility than she already believes herself to have.
Yes, but also the society and her husband, because the best way of making ourselves as secure as possible in the expectation that the child will be born as healthy as possibly could be is to make the life of the mother during her pregnancy as happy in all respects as one possibly can. And this certainly is not too much to ask. It means that not only should her diet be adequate and well balanced, but also her psychological, emotional, social experience should be well balanced.
Really means she has to watch her own thoughts, practically.
Well, not by becoming anxious about the situation. On the other hand, to realize that anxiety is the voice of fear, and there is nothing to be afraid of, that this is a very happy kind of experience for a woman to be going through, and also she has a right to expect that her society will help her to make the best of it, and not to put it entirely upon her own responsibility.
So what you've been saying, Dr. Montagu, is that the mother, from the very moment of the conception of her child, carries responsibility not only for his body, but for his whole personality, his fate in life. But you will concede, I suppose, that what happens after the child is born has at least as much importance as his prenatal experience. So in our next discussion, let's climb out of the womb and into those first vulnerable years in which the child's own personality is established, for better or worse.